Each year, the sea level rises,
setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control.
10 hottest years ever measured.
Climate change is our single greatest security threat.
You are failing us.
Governments know it. Even the United States military knows it. None of this is rhetoric, and none of it is hysteria. It is fact.
House on fire.
Welcome to the House on Fire podcast, powered by the Clio Institute. I'm your host, Dania Toledo, coming to you from ground zero of the climate crisis, Miami, Florida. Today, we're talking to Nadia Seeteram, a Columbia Climate School research scientist who recently published a study in the journal Environmental Research Letters. She'll be joining us remotely from her current location in Washington, D.C. Let's go. So, hi, Nadia. How are you doing today?
Hi, Dania. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Great to have you on House on Fire.
And thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for your time. So like I mentioned, you were published recently in Environmental Research Letters. Your article was amazing, by the way. Really loved reading it. It was very insightful. So I wanted to start with, what were the key findings of the study you published recently in that journal?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for the question and just for the opportunity to talk about the study. So before I get into the results, I think maybe I'd like to take a step back and just maybe talk about how the study was different, from studies that I think have come before. It's no surprise to anyone that flooding and sort of sea level rise are affecting communities right now. And I think up until this point, a lot of the studies that I had really seen just sort of attempt to understand flooding and migration in response to it just really in sort of one way. They really just sort of say, okay, well, if you're affected by flooding at this time point, you have maybe the potential to sort of move. And that's how we really sort of think about, these estimates for who might be moving in response to sea level rise or something like that. But we know, and living in Miami, that flooding affects people in different ways. The responses that communities have across the county are really variable. They can be, and that really because people have different socioeconomic, conditions that they're sort of working through. And so that's what this study really tries to do. It tries to actually look at the intersection of flooding and the socioeconomic spectrum to really understand the ways in which people respond to flooding differently and how that might actually lead to different outcomes within climate migration. So we try to actually broaden that sort of understanding of climate migration, that people will move and respond in different ways. And so we created this framework, and it really categorizes people in 4 different ways, again, at that intersection of flooding and just sort of socioeconomic response. And by that, I mean really just the capacity of people to respond. Wealthier people have greater capacity to respond to anything really, but especially flooding. And then and less wealthy residents, will sort of struggle to sort of do the same. And so the 4 different categories that we kind of came up with were stable, migrating, displaced, and trapped. And I'll work through each of those. So when I say a stable community, what I actually mean is a community, not necessarily that doesn't ever see any kind of flooding, but a community that won't see very much flooding. And even if it did, those residents living in those areas probably have greater resources, greater capacity to respond. So I'm thinking here of, maybe a Coral Gables type of a neighborhood. And then on that same, again, just really thinking about people who just have greater access to resources, higher incomes. Then we have people in sort of the migrating category. Now, these are people that are really directly impacted by flooding. These are people along Miami Beach, some of the coastlines in some of the different islands, Bal Harbor, Brickell, those kind of areas. They are directly impacted by sea level rise. They are actually seeing their streets flood. They may have their cars flooded if they're outside and not in a garage. And maybe they're sort of thinking to themselves, okay, well, this isn't the best long-term investment for me in the long run. So maybe I might actually want to move. But the point is that they have the capacity to kind of do that on their own. And some of the research that has been produced actually shows that in terms of receiving help from the government or resources from the government, some of these communities, they might actually be better positioned, I would say, to receive some of these benefits. And so that might help them sort of secure a buyout for their neighborhood. They have political capital, all of these things that they're sort of leveraging. It's not just sort of wealth in some ways. So those are sort of the migrating category. Then when we take a look at, folks who are on sort of we're a bit more vulnerable socioeconomically. We have sort of this displaced community or what we call the displaced community. Now, these aren't people that are actually affected very often by, the direct impacts by flooding, but because people in the migrating category, investments, money might actually be flowing to these more resilient, sort of safer areas. If there's nothing in place that would actually help the residents who are currently living in these areas to sort of withstand those forces, they could also be displaced from their homes as it becomes more unaffordable. And that really captures that climate gentrification phenomena that we hear a lot about in Miami. And then finally, we have these sort of trapped communities. These are communities that, again, are actually highly impacted by sort of flooding and sea level rise impacts, and again, have fewer resources, fewer capacities to actually be able to do anything and sort of mitigate their risks on their own. So in trapped, when I say the trapped here, it's actually more of sort of a lack of movement in some ways. And that could be either physical, but for the most part, it is mostly, I would say, financial as well. And so the study, should I pause there or?
No, of course, keep going.
Okay. And so the study, all we're really doing is trying to sort folks who are currently living in Miami into one of those four categories so that we can really see how sea level rise might play out, across, this sort of socioeconomic spectrum in Miami. And so what we found, and again, we did this, under scenarios of no sea level rise or sort of zero sea level rise, and then all the way up to 3 meters of sea level rise, around 10 feet. So I'll start first with like our 1 meter sort of scenario, around 3 feet of sea level rise. We found that about 1/4 of the current population of Miami, I would say a little bit more than that, actually would be sort of directly impacted and sorted into the migrating and trapped communities. So that's about 90% of the current population would be sorted into the trapped category and about 7% into the migrating category. That may not sound a lot, but when you break it down across all the municipalities in Miami-Dade, and we've got about 34 municipalities and then unincorporated Dade as well, that translates into at least 9 municipalities in Miami-Dade County that would have 50% or more of their total population exposed to flooding under a 1 meter scenario of sea level rise. That means that doesn't necessarily mean they will move, but that's a huge amount of the population that has the potential to be impacted, the potential to move. This includes at this point Miami Beach, which is a majority trapped city, Aventura as well. And then also Key Biscayne, but that would be more in sort of the migrating category, that community.
So they would have more of a capacity by multiple socioeconomic factors to be able to move out if necessary.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Now, then when we get to sort of 2 meters, around sort of 6 feet of sea level rise, this really huge shift occurs where both inland and coastal residents are impacted by sea level rise. So we estimated that more than half, about 54.7% of Miami would be impacted by sea level rise at that point. And that means, I would argue that sea level rise is a everybody problem in Miami right now, but it really does make it an all of Miami problem at that point.
That's
and I would
so
also,
many people.
that's a lot of people, yeah. And that's the current population, right? This is not what the future population is.
Especially with a lot of people moving down here, that number is probably aiming to go up somewhat.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That for those people who are in the business of predicting population, that's pretty much what they say. And so that's a huge number of people. Again, it makes it both an inland and a coastal problem. And I would also say that, and not to be very scary about it, but I do think that around 2 meters of sea level rise is a possibility for Miami-Dade by the end of the century if if climate change, if sea level rise accelerates, if we don't do anything to sort of really, stop, stop sort of our emissions and all of that. So I do think it is a potential concern for the future, or a potential reality for the future. Again, it's really hard. We're in the business of trying to predict the future, but it's really hard to say with any certainty. And so now going to the indirect impacts, and this is where I think this is, really, something that is really interesting about our study, and being able to, kind of break this down. So what we see is that people move from being indirectly impacted to directly impacted, as I just sort of told you. Now, by 3 meters, which is around 10 feet, the highest amount of sea level rise that we considered, and again, this is far, in the future, but what we find is that only 8% of the current population of Miami would not be exposed to flooding, and the majority of those folks live in Coral Gables. So Coral Gables, so only Coral Gables had less than 50% of their population not exposed to flooding at this level of sea level rise. And so it's very stable in that sort of sense. But that 8%, that really represents the highest points of elevation in Miami. So those could be the areas where people seek to buy now, because they are the best sort of long-term, most resilient areas, for the future.
That's super interesting. And hearing even like 6 feet of sea level rise, I am 5'7". That is just a few inches over me. And I know what a 6 feet deep pool looks like and feels like. So that's super concerning to know that just that much sea level rise could affect more than half of the county, which horrifying information.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So
It's not, it
it's
is.
okay. I mean, it's better to know than to not know, in my opinion. But regarding this study, so what did your study predict for the future of Miami inhabitants in terms of climate change? And you kind of went a little into this already, but how would the future of specific areas like Little Haiti look like, say, 50, 100 years into the future, as you mentioned, and other areas like that are more socioeconomically impacted by these sort of developments?
Yeah. Well, so I wouldn't say that we predicted anything,
Mhm,
because prediction is kind of a strong word in our business. What we tried to do is show potential futures that could
mhm,
occur. So one thing that's very important to understand about my study is that, again, we used the current population of Miami. We didn't try to predict how the population would change. We also did not consider any adaptation intervention. So
mm,
that doesn't, at the moment, the county is preparing to sort of adapt. So this didn't include any adaptation intervention, which could reduce the amount of people that are exposed through time. And
mhm,
also, we held the level of socioeconomic vulnerability, as you mentioned, constant. So that
mhm.
also is the same. So we were really just trying to figure out, what could the future look like. And so what I would say is that, just based on the study itself, what we understand about how people are thinking about this and currently reacting, I would say that areas like Little Haiti, some areas of Liberty City, and then also some areas, really along the Atlantic coastal ridge, the highest points of elevation in Miami. So that includes places in South Dade as well. Um, they were those areas that were considered to be, that have some of the higher points of elevation. And so I think we could very much continue to see those areas continuing to gentrify, just because of the way that development is sort of playing out in Miami-Dade at the moment, and also because of that climate factor kind of amplifying that pressure as well.
Definitely. And like you said, there's a lot of factors that remain the same in your research, not really accounting for any adaptation policies that are going to be put in place maybe in the future, or working towards it now. Can you explain the details of how you conducted your research in South Florida on more of a day-to-day basis, to kind of understand where all these numbers came from?
Sure. Yeah. So I will say that what I do is not particularly glamorous as a scientist. I have colleagues who will like post photos of them being outside doing, sampling in the Everglades or something, or working in the lab or something really cool like that. I don't do that. I work primarily at my computer. And so I'm usually processing a lot of different flood models. And so usually I am honestly writing code, looking at to help me sort of process all this sort of information about flooding and different model projections that we have. But in addition to just looking at, what's the flooding going to look like, I also try to put together that economic and societal portion. So I'm looking at lots of different data sets. So the flooding data sets, census data sets. I also try to incorporate the lived experience as much as I can in my work. And so for me, that meant actually interviewing residents across the city. I did this during the pandemic when we weren't really allowed to talk to people in person.
Oh,
So that
that's
meant lots of,
so interesting. So
yeah.
interesting.
So I had to reach out to all kinds of networks and advertise the study, and we did get 40 people to sign up and participate in these hour-long interviews, but they happened but via Zoom. They didn't happen in person. And also sometimes my day looks like, designing a survey to really, again, capture as much as possible what is actually occurring right now and what do people think about in the future. It's great to have flood models, and it's great to really understand how the world could change on the physical side, but it's even better to put what people are experiencing right now, how they feel about it in the future, with that, to really paint a full picture of the potential responses that people are actually considering now. Where might we need to, educate folks in the future? How might our strategy, need to change based on what people are telling us? So my day is, mostly spent at the computer, but that's pretty much what I do. I should say, I do spend a good amount of time thinking about how best to communicate this information as well. Because of the nature of work, as an adaptation scientist, we're thinking about how will society adapt in the future. And so that again, it can't just stay in the space of the flood models. It has to include people, decision makers, community leaders, nonprofit organizations, all of these people who are working on this exact issue, and really communicating with them as well, on how best what kinds of research questions we should be asking, and maybe even asking for their help and in helping us sort of carry out that research as well, as I had to rely on community partners to again get people into the interviews during the
Of
pandemic.
course. And community is so important, especially
Absolutely.
in South Florida, especially as like we've mentioned, socioeconomic factors determine really how much people are able to move around and how they experience their day-to-day life. Community building and community work is so important, especially working at Clio as a nonprofit. Like, that importance is very prevalent to us. Um, and as
Absolutely.
someone,
And folks, oh, I'm sorry.
oh no, no,
I
go
wanted to
ahead.
say that folks at Clio were very supportive of this work and definitely did their best to and help me kind of reach out to the community again to advertise the interview.
Of course. And continuing on this conversation, I myself live in Miami, live in the Little Havana area, and I've been seeing a lot of development recently. And in our conversation so far, you've mentioned a few times now climate gentrification. There's a lot of emphasis on on that topic as of late. Um, but you've also mentioned, I'm not so sure if we've mentioned it in this call yet, but in previous discussions, climate related migration. Could you
Mhm.
explain the difference between both of those terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So climate-related migration or climate migration, I see as more of this sort of umbrella term for all of the different ways in which climate can really affect or influence someone to move. In response. And so, something that I really wanted to incorporate in my study, again, is all the different ways in which people could be moving from as a result of climate. So we talked a little bit about sort of the direct sort of impacts, like people could actually be moving because flooding itself, has actually disrupted their way of life, such that they need to move. And again, so that's sort of those migrating and trapped sort of communities. But then where climate gentrification, I think, falls into this category is that, people who people may not be experiencing that sort of direct sort of flooding impact, but because others who have might move into those areas and again kind of drive up the costs and reduce the affordability of those areas, and it happens to it is happening to coincide um, in these areas where historically underrepresented communities have lived for decades, that I think is also a form of climate related migration as well. It's just kind of, again, under that sort of umbrella. I think it's really important to really make sure that we keep tying these ways in which climate affects different people together. So it may not be sort of from the direct impact, it's probably an indirect impact, but it is still
An
amplified by that
impact.
climate. Exactly, by that climate pressure.
And already Miami is seeing an extreme affordability crisis across the county.
Mhm.
I would even dare to say across Florida altogether, different coastal communities are experiencing the same sort of issues. So it's really important to keep into consideration climate gentrification as a form of climate related issues, considering climate
Mhm.
is such a threat amplifier in many ways. Um, so thank you for explaining that. I wanted to move on a little bit to something the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, had said. So NOAA has predicted that large parts of U.S. coastal cities could be submerged from 42 to 84 inches of sea level rise by the end of the century. This is a lot of inches. I am aware. Are there any changes that we could make to avoid this difficult future?
Absolutely. So we're going to have to play offense and defense. And I think that is, I'm in, my work really focuses on the defense side. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But essentially, we really have to acknowledge that sea level rise is occurring, it's here, and be really realistic about what that means. And that to me means having in our mindset that we have to build with that future in mind, that we have to develop with that future in mind. You have to have that sort of long term approach to any kind of development and investment in the future. And so we are going to have to build more resiliently in the future. So again, just sort of adapting, build more resiliently in the future. That means not building in areas that we know are very high risk, retreating from those areas that we know are very high risk, upgrading our infrastructure, again, building that in mind with the climate of the future, with the conditions of the future in mind. And then also, again, on the offense side, we have to reduce the amount of our fossil fuel dependence. We have to stop emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that are warming our atmosphere, beyond just the normal point, actually accelerating climate change. And so we have to do both. We have to adapt because that's just the future, but we need to also prevent the need for even more adaptation in the future.
Correct. And I'm so glad that you mentioned both like the offensive and the defensive side of things because at Clio, at least since I've started working here, the something that they've really ingrained into us is the importance of both mitigation and adaptation and how so many of our policies now focus on adaptation without really taking into consideration attacking the root causes of the issue, which is climate change, which is the emission of these greenhouse gases and not clean energy. So it's great that you're mentioning this. I hope our audience takes that into consideration. Um, Nothing can really be done without really attacking the root causes.
Absolutely.
Um, so a study from 2017 said that sea level rise could displace as many as 13 million people in the United States by 2100, which you've said is within the next century. So how could that migration look like?
Yeah. So again, really important to note that these types of studies, and even in mind to some degree, what we do is we sort of say, for the most part, if you are impacted at a certain point of time, we count you as being sort of as having the potential to migrate. And that's sort of how we get that number. So one thing that I want to sort of add a little nuance here, and again, we do this just to kind of get the really big picture of what we're potentially looking at. But for the most part, people do not really move that way, right? People do not pick up and say, "Oh, I'm flooded today, I'm going to move," right? That, I mean, everybody in Miami would have, it would be a ghost town by now. So that's not how
Especially with the
people.
hurricane parties. If you're not
Yeah,
from Miami, I hope you understand. Hurricanes come around. No one's leaving. It's a hurricane
exactly.
party.
Definitely. So yeah, so no one is really leaving. So in addition to that the study that we talked about earlier, where I was again trying to explore these potential futures and just sort of see what the world looks like or what Miami-Dade looks like under these different categories of migration. Uh, I also conducted about 40 interviews, I mentioned already, and then about 600 surveys with residents across Miami-Dade to really understand, how well does that framing, these concepts, these categories that I just sort of developed, does it actually align with how people feel right now? And is that a useful way of thinking about the world in the future? And so, in that study, what we really found, first of all, and especially in the interviews, uh, no one said that they were moving just because of flooding. If flooding was a primary reason for moving, it was always flooding and some other reason, like affordability. Oh, I'm being flooded quite a bit, and also it's really expensive to live in Miami-Dade, so I'm going to move north. Or flooding and retirement. Well, we don't want to deal with hurricane seasons anymore. We flooded too much and we're retiring, so now we'll move to another part of Florida or North Carolina or all the different locations that people mentioned. And so
And
I
I'd
think that's
also,
a
and I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I
no.
also assume like flooding and the effect that that has on like the infrastructure of their home repairs and all that stuff, like the cost of those repairs, it seems are also going higher, especially as
Yes.
insurance companies are not wanting to support that sort of work. So I think that would be another factor I'd assume that would play into that effect.
It definitely did, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But you're absolutely right. It's always sort of this. It's always flooding, and then sort of something else that might actually prompt people to move. So when you ask me what that migration might look like, if they're for the most part, it's going to just look a little bit different than what those studies sort of predict. People will move when they hit a threshold of when they're sort of ready to move. It's never going to be just because of flooding. It's usually going to be something else. What would happen is that a flooding and sea level rise might reshape some of the choices that people make, and it's going to be
Mm.
integrated into their decision to move. So, for example, I spoke to a lot of younger folks who, were really wary of how expensive it is to buy in Miami-Dade, how the risk of your home being flooded exactly as you said, and then you can't maybe afford the repairs or the damages, or insurance costs are really high. And so to them, even though they don't want to leave, maybe they'll go to another part of Florida. And so that is really how I think this will sort of play out in the future.
Yeah, that would also be a concern for me. I'm currently paying rent for a little efficiency house type thing, and
Yeah.
it's kind of crazy at this day and age. Um, so going in beyond the migration of all these people, moving beyond the US
Mhm.
altogether, your study says that estimates of displacement by sea level rise range from 88 million to 1.4 billion people globally by 2100. That's a significant chunk of people. Could you give us a sense of what areas of the world might be most affected by this displacement and where they might migrate to?
Yeah. So one thing I just want to kind of clarify is that is a statistic that we cited in the study, but our study doesn't actually.
Mhm.
We didn't produce that result because our study is focused on Miami-Dade. But you're right; those are what some of the leading. We cited those studies that again try to figure out around the world, how many people could be potentially displaced by sea level rise. And so you're absolutely right. Globally, climate migration is occurring, at an increase at a much higher rate than it is sort of, I would say, in the U.S. And that is where actually a lot of the research effort is sort of focused. In 2022, I'm not sure if you recall, but Pakistan saw devastating floods, of a third, I believe, of the country. And it's not just flooding; there are all these other climate impacts as well. Like, for example, there was a severe drought in East Africa, and so at the
Yeah.
moment, um, the research indicates that climate-related migration, again, not just in response to sort of flooding, but other hazards as well, will occur more often in places like sub-Saharan Africa, East and South Asia, the Pacific Islands. And what the research shows about these type of migrations is that people are not crossing, international borders. Most of this migration is occurring internally and within the
Internally.
country. Exactly. Just as it is here, right? Like it's
Correct.
no one's moving to Canada. People
So
are just
many
moving to the
people,
next county.
and
Yeah,
that could also be affected again by those socioeconomic factors where a lot of people don't have the means to just pick up and leave the country, even if the country as a whole is experiencing an extreme form of climate related issue, whether it be flooding or um, drought.
absolutely. Because migration is a form of adaptation as well. And so if you're in this, most people don't want to migrate. They want to stay in their homes. And so if you're in that position of having to migrate, it's probably because you're not doing so well, and you're not able to sort of financially sort of stay in your home. And so you're already in a very vulnerable position in the first place.
Definitely. And more broadly, what sectors of society would you say would be most impacted by sea level rise?
Yeah, I find this to be a really interesting question, and it made me think a little bit because the way that I think about this is not that sea level rise will affect any one sector, but that it actually sort of affects really the fabric of life, just sort of the
Mhm.
social fabric of life. And just thinking about, a heavy rainfall event in Miami. From that study that I mentioned earlier, for the most part, when people describe being flooded in the past 5 years in Miami-Dade, they were being flooded because of rainwater, or sometimes the combination of rainfall and high tides at the same time. So it hasn't been the sort of coastal storm that I think is really kind of top of mind for people. And so what that says to me is that this flooding is now more every day. It's sort of chronic. It's disrupting the way that people are able to sort of go to work or go to school. Another interesting part of that study, 1/3 of the survey respondents said that they had missed work or school due to flooding. And, it's because people are making a really big choice here. Do I drive my car through floodwater and risk it being damaged, and then I don't have a car and I didn't make it to work or school anyways? And but that
Or
is
even like
that.
some of those people that don't have maybe a vehicle, a personal vehicle that they could use.
Mhm.
So they depend on public transit and walking to work or walking to school. They're not really interested in maybe walking through floodwater or extreme heavy winds and rain at the same time. Like it could be a lot of factors as well, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. I mean, when I interviewed specifically the seniors that were in that study, they really raised a lot of concerns about, just not feeling very comfortable walking through that amount of, I mean, I'm talking about just seniors in general, but I'm sure there are other
Mhm.
segments of the population, as you mentioned, that wouldn't be comfortable walking through that amount of water. They raised concerns about down power lines and just not even being
Mm.
sure of whether or not they, be electrocuted if they were walking through if they couldn't really see very well. So there are all these different concerns that sort of come up, including would floodwaters prevent emergency services, as well. And so it's really about just the ways in which it sort of disrupts sort of the fabric of life. If you imagine that 1/3 of people said that they missed work or school, now what does that look like 5, 10 years ago, as we expect these sort of floods to sort of intensify, unless we act now and actually do something that really improves our infrastructure such that this water can actually drain out.
You raise a very valid point. 1/3 of your survey.
Mhm.
Honestly, I would imagine that's 300 people of your no, 200 of your
That's
600?
200. Yeah. That's
Math
still a
is not
lot.
my
Yeah.
strong suit, but that is still a
That's
lot.
okay.
Um,
No, I
so
was really
then
shocked by that result.
honestly, yeah, I would say that I'm shocked. However, I also feel like that number makes sense considering how things are playing out currently. Um, but now that we've kind of been discussing not only just Miami-Dade, but the US, the world, etc., would you say that there are any particular countries or cities or counties that are doing a good job of preparing for climate-related migration now?
Yeah. I would say that for the most part, I mean, there's so many considerations in that. For the most part, I would say that a lot of cities, counties are very much still in the early stages, and there is still a lot of discussion sort of ongoing. I think the key thing here is that, is really looking at who is doing this sort of proactively, because at the moment there's, you could say that from our federal, if the source of some of the funding for these efforts is federal, that usually comes after a disaster has occurred. It's not necessarily always been
Not a
proactive money.
preemptive thing.
Exactly. It's been very reactive. That's sort of trying to change with some of the new laws and money that is coming out of the IRA and all that. But again, it's a
Definitely.
very small amount in relation to the need. One interesting place, New York State passed a bond act, I believe in 2022.
So somewhat recently.
Yes, very somewhat recently. Um, and that actually created a fund for them to do coastal sort of resilience sort of efforts. A portion of that is going to go to proactive buyouts across the state. So that's one state that I'm going to
Oh,
be very interested in sort of looking at how they kind of manage that, because I would assume that that would also need to include relocation for people, and they'd have to think about economic development of other areas. But I will say that along the same line, the country of Bangladesh is actually doing some really interesting work.
interesting.
Yeah. So Bangladesh is a country that sees about maybe 500,000 people a year moving into its capital, Dhaka. So a lot of, so a lot of the disasters, and other reasons why people are migrating, it's really resulting in a lot of intense urbanization. And so what they're trying to do is actually trying to reduce some of that urbanization and make kind of more migrant friendly towns. So they're a little bit away from the sort of larger cities, but actually hopefully closer to where the areas of where people might actually be migrating from, so that they kind of can maintain some of those social networks in the process. But I think the things that are really important is that they, it really means for them, they need to, in these smaller areas, they need to invest more in sort of low cost housing, in upgrading the infrastructure of those areas, but also providing economic opportunities. So they're also trying to kind of coordinate these new sort of migrant friendly towns near economic centers where migrants will have opportunities to participate in society in that way. So again, trying to relieve, again, intense sort of urbanization. And again, I don't know all the details, but what I do know is that does require coordination between the local governments and NGOs. And I do think that, there are really interesting examples for us to learn here in the US, as, again, we are also running out of space in our cities as well.
Definitely. That is more true than I wish I could say. Um, so that's very interesting. How about bringing it back more locally to us, Miami? How would you say Miami can prepare better for sea level rise?
Yeah. Again, so I would stress that importance of being proactive here. That is the key thing that we need to see from counties, cities, our decision makers, kind of going forward, whether or not they sort of have that proactive approach, because that means they have a long-term approach in mind. And that's what we really need to be thinking about. It's not just thinking, not just about what's happening today or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but really, beyond that, are we really having that long-term approach in mind? The great thing is the county is, really engaged in this effort. They've put out a sea level rise strategy that has about 5 different ideas that they are thinking about in terms of transformation for Miami. That includes, building on fill, expanding blue and green waterways, building on higher elevated areas, and I think some other ones. I can't name them all at the moment, but if you're interested, Google the Miami-Dade County Sea Level Rise Strategy. It's really interesting, and I know that they work very hard on that. At the same time, people in Miami do need to be realistic. You need to build and develop for the future, and that does mean you probably shouldn't be building in areas that we know to be very high risk. It just doesn't. It's not the best, sort of long-term use of money. And along with that, both with, I would say, just in the retreating factor, in the building more resilient factor, or effort, excuse me, and in both of those efforts, I would say that we really need to prioritize equity, because there is the real chance that, or the real Yeah, the real concern that you're going to be leaving behind lots of people as you sort of move to the future, because building resiliently is expensive. It is more expensive than building
Definitely.
right now, and everything is expensive at the moment. And so we really, need to, that has to be a part of the conversation, or it will not, be carried, I think, into the future.
And the Miami that we know and love today will definitely not look like the Miami of the future if equity isn't taken into consideration as well. So I completely agree
Absolutely.
with that sentiment. So you have actually migrated yourself from, you told me earlier you grew up in New York City, you lived in Miami, now you've moved back to New York City. Can you tell us what sort of research you're working on at the Columbia Climate School?
Yeah, so I'm very much on, I've been really sort of, I think, inspired by, some of the just the idea that we need to build more resiliently, because I think it's a bit more forward looking, I should say. And it actually kind of was inspired by some of this one question that I had in the survey that I asked people. Again, so Miami-Dade residents, I asked them, if you had to move from Miami, because of flooding, where would you go? And the top three answers were all answers in Florida. So the desire to stay in Florida was very strong. People said Orlando first, then North Florida, and then Broward County, the next county up, which arguably has the same problems that Miami-Dade has. To,
Definitely, definitely. Oh, that's so
yeah,
funny.
yeah, absolutely. And so to me that indicates that we need to be building more resiliently, that we have to really keep that in mind. And so the work that I'm doing right now is really just sort of thinking through, what does it look like to build a more climate resilient housing stock across the US. What it really means is, how do we reduce the impacts of these climate hazards on housing? And that's really important, as I think you mentioned earlier earlier in our conversation, that insurers are pulling out of certain areas like California, Louisiana, and parts of Florida as well, and whether or not the insurance costs are so high that it's making housing affordability so out of reach for so many people. And so reducing risks that will lower those rates is actually really, really important. And we can do this in different ways. We can, not build in areas that we know to be high risk, and we can, of course, increase the structural integrity of homes. But just with those two things alone, a lot of people have to be in on those decisions. That includes local governments, mortgage lenders, insurers, urban planners, architects, real estate developers, home construction companies. There's so many people that need to get on board with the idea of building resiliently. My research is really focused on, how are they doing this? If they are, not, what are the main barriers and tensions that we need to address so that we can have a more climate resilient housing stock?
Well, that's so important. And again, speaks to the power of community. Nothing is ever done with just one person. It's really a group
Exactly.
effort, especially at the larger scales, like you mentioned, insurers, counties, municipalities, all the different associations. Like it's so important for everyone to really band together to ensure a livable future in the places that everyone wants to be in and maybe wants to stay in.
Absolutely.
Um, so far, we've talked about some very heavy topics, lots of doom and gloom. Can you leave us with some sense of hope about the future of our climate and sea level rise?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can. The way I see it, something that really gives me hope all the time is really exactly as you said, just the community of people. You know, it I am inspired by, I feel hopeful, you know, just knowing that I'm not the only person sort of working on this, that there is a community of people working on this across Miami-Dade. There are so many amazing, hardworking, dedicated people working in government, in at the universities, at nonprofits, in community organizations, even concerned residents. That really, you know, want people to understand, what's sort of coming in our future and want to prepare for this, are trying to design a sustainable, resilient, equitable future. That really does give me hope. Um, And that is something that I think we all have to, that we all lean on. The other thing I would also say, and something that I'm becoming more, I think, inspired by, is the idea that, yeah, you're right. There's so much to grieve. There's so much loss, and I think we absolutely have to make space for that. It's just it's a lot, right? It's communities and ecosystems and property, of course, but just yeah, this your sense of who you are sort of in the world, and your connection to people and place. Those are all things that I think there has to be the space to sort of grieve for that. I also think on the other side of grief is sort of transformation, is sort of the idea that we
Definitely.
have this opportunity to now innovate, to sort of transform our world, to put forth the ideas about what we want our world to look like, because it's not going to be the same one. And I really hope that people hear this and feel inspired to do that, because plans will move ahead if we, without us, if we don't voice, our vision for the future and sort of contribute to that. And I think there's a lot of space for creativity and innovation and imagination here. And I really encourage everyone to do that, especially because the one thing that does concern me is that when I do see, again, sort of these artistic renderings of the future, they do make me feel currently like that future is only catering to one segment of society. And so if we don't sort of force ourselves and our vision and our thoughts and our hopes, for what the future can look like, and if we kind of don't make that a part of the future, I mean, there is a real chance that we could be left, people could be left behind. So um, I would really encourage people to, if they feel inspired to do it, think about what world they want to live in, and think about what society they want to live in, and how can we, with this terrible moment, kind of reimagine a better future for all of us.
I love that so much. I just really want to talk quickly about one of my colleagues, one of my friends. Her name is Isabella. She's planning to be in she's majoring in urban regional planning. That's her she's doing her master's in that, and she envisions sustainable cities everywhere. And her big thing that she tells people all the time is that no matter what it is that you do, no matter what you decide to work in, there's always a space for you and your creative vision and your hopes for the future to integrate into what you want to see in the future moving forward. And I think what you said really speaks to that as well, because everyone can take part in building a future that is resilient and that is helpful and that integrates everyone and re- retains community and keeps the people there and um living and not having to leave, which is what so many people fear is change. But if you can make that change for the better, it's only going to be helpful in the future.
I so wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. Yeah, it's the one thing that definitely gives me hope.
Awesome. And then before we end today, is there anything you would like to add, whether it's something about your research, something that you look forward to, something that you want the audience to take away from our whole discussion?
Yeah, I mean, like your friend Isabella said, I think, we have to live on this planet, I mean, for gosh, I mean, hopefully a few more, many more decades, right? So we should take part in that future of what we want that future to look like. So yeah, I think exactly as your friend said, create that space, let your vision really be heard. I think that's so important moving forward.
Right. Well, thank you so much again, Nadia, for coming on House on Fire. It was a pleasure to have this discussion with you, and I wish you the best of luck in your current research and everything else that is to follow in the coming years.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so great. I really appreciate it.
And there we have it, another fantastic episode of House on Fire. Remember to keep an eye on Nadia as she continues to do some cutting edge climate research at the Columbia Climate School. House on Fire is powered by the Clio Institute and could not be possible without the support of the Lynn and Lewis Wolfson II Family Foundation. Today's episode is hosted by me, Dania Toledo, and is produced by Michael Landsberg and Ryan Ners of Unicorn Fire Studios. The music is composed by the Microscopic Orchestra. If you're loving what we do here at House on Fire, don't forget to drop a 5-star review on your favorite platform. It really helps us out a lot. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you know when we drop a new episode. And until next time, listeners, stay safe and remember to protect our Earth.